Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political team. Chris, you have the floor.
Great, thank you, Megan. Greetings. Welcome everyone to the Ipsos Inside Track for August 2024. We're glad to have you with us. As Megan said, I'm Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with the Public Affairs polling team here at Ipsos. I am joined by my colleague, Sarah Feldman, our editorial director, and Bernard Mendez, data journalist with the team. We have a lot of data to share with you. There have been a couple of things happening out in the world that we have been trying to keep track of. So let's just dive right into the agenda. There are a number of things we'll walk through. I will introduce sort of the main issues, the landscape of America at the moment, and then pass it over to Sarah to go through a number of those issues: the economy, the Supreme Court, free speech, and the impact of the vice presidential picks on the race. Bernard will do a deep dive on some of our election polling that we've done recently. We've been getting much more active in our election research in the last month or so as we near the actual day of elections, just about 2.5 months away now. And then we'll close looking ahead to the rest of the year and our forecast for what we expect to see in November. And as Megan said, we will take questions at the end with whatever time we have remaining. So if you do have any questions at any point, please don't hesitate to use that Q&A feature of the GoToWebinar application, and we will get to all the questions. And if you do put a question in, please make sure to put your name in. If we don't get time to answer your question, we will certainly send you an email with a response after the meeting. Also, all of this information, all of this data is public information, public data. It's all things that we have published, so it is available on the Ipsos website. We encourage you to check it out at any time. You can just go to ipsos.com, and it's all going to be there. And as Megan said, this webinar will be recorded and posted on the website, and this deck that we're sharing with you will also be posted on the website. So again, all of this information is available to you. You're welcome to pull it down. You're welcome to share it, anything you want. So let's dive into the main issues. What are we seeing? So this first slide is from an election poll we did just about 2 weeks ago now, where we did a national survey and a survey of the 7 swing states as a group, not each one individually, but as a group, asking what people think the main issue is. It's a little bit different than the main issue we share normally, which if you've been with us before, you've seen where we ask in this one what your top 3 issues are, not your top 1. So it's a little bit of a different landscape. So rather than asking people to pick the one thing that they're interested in, we give them a little bit of flexibility. And when we do that, we see that inflation or increasing costs continues to be a dominant concern. Half of Americans saying that's one of their top worries, slightly more in the swing states, which are those gray bars that are just behind the purple ones for the national one. And then after that, we have a number of other issues that are sort of important to a significant chunk of Americans, if not necessarily the majority issue that inflation is. Immigration, 33%, political extremism, and crime and gun violence in the low 20s, healthcare, housing availability, debt, climate change in the high teens. All sort of important issues, leading issues to a substantial block of the electorate. That I think, this is going to be sort of the thing that the issues that sort of influence what we see in the election this fall. And what we're seeing again is that inflation, sort of the thing that everyone's kind of feeling, continues to be sort of cross-cutting. And then all of these other issues that are a little bit more sectorial, immigration, for instance, much more of a Republican concern, political extremism, more of a Democratic concern. So looking at the trend of the main issues, and this is again going back to our more standard version where we just ask one. So again, it's a slightly different look at the data. It's just what's the one thing that's most important to you. We see that the political extremism and the economy are actually tracking pretty closely together. The economy slightly higher, but again, very closely together. And immigration has actually fallen off slightly over the last few months as a main issue. Partially, we think that is driven by immigration has actually dropped across the southern border, but also there's actually just less people talking about it right now. Concerns about immigration does tend to correlate pretty highly with the amount of media coverage it gets. And instead, we're seeing sort of the economy and political extremism as sort of those sort of tied in that number 1 position. And again, very close together. This data, of course, is from July. Our next wave of the core political that this is based on will actually come out next week. So we will get an update for it next week. Again, check that out on our website. Next slide, please. and then just sort of another piece of just sort of context setting is now that we are in the campaign cycle, people are getting contacted by the campaigns pretty aggressively. We can see that a majority of Americans have seen political ads, particularly in the swing states. It's almost universal. Some people I know that live in some of the swing states say that it's not just that you're seeing them, it's that you are getting bombarded by them. It is a constant flood of these advertisements that people are seeing. Also, like outreach from the campaign, text messages, emails, pretty prolific, maybe not quite the same level as the ads, but still a lot happening. And even actual phone calls still going in to people. So lots of activity, but then only about 1 in 10 say that they've actually donated to a political campaign or issue organization. So despite those huge fundraising totals you may see reported in the news, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars in fundraising, it's actually still only a small minority of Americans who are contributing to those campaigns. So it's sort of somewhat interesting. Next. So what slide we want to show you, and this is actually a repeat of something we shared with you a few months ago, but this is looking at what people consider to be their top concern by where they get their news from. And this is something that we like to sort of repeat over and over again, because our view is that information sources, news sources, has a huge impact on how people see the world. Conservative media, that's Fox, Newsmax, OANN, talk radio, those kind of things. You can see immigration, political extremism, by far seen as the major issues, huge numbers on those, versus mainstream media, which is just sort of our grab bag of like CNN, MSNBC, nightly news, newspapers, sort of all of the sort of established stuff. A little bit more of a spread with inflation, but then political extremism a little bit higher, immigration lower, and then digital news, local news, social media, again, some big differences in terms of how people, what news or what issues people are sort of seeing. You can see, though, again, sort of through most of these, inflation is something that is sort of dominant. That's part of why it is such a dominant issue across the country, is it's actually seen similarly across all the different news sources, though, again, immigration versus political extremism, depending on where you get the news from, the priority it's given is significantly different. Next. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Sarah now to talk about the economy. Lots of interesting twists and turns, including actually some data that came out this morning that we don't have in here, that the government actually downstated the number of new jobs over the last year, which don't know what that means yet, but still lots of interesting things happening. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, like Chris said, there's a lot going on with the economy. It's the #1 issue for Americans. So we'll be spending some time unpacking what that really means and getting into some nuances there. So here we're starting off with our Consumer Confidence Index. This index goes all the way back to 2002, but if we just zero in on the past year or so, we can see that consumer confidence has really been nudging up. It's been trending upward. Last month, it hit a 2-year high. It's down slightly this month, but still up relative to this time last year and the beginning of the year. But it's still not quite as high as we might expect given the larger macroeconomic environment, despite some of that negative downgrading of jobs Chris mentioned at the top. Overall Americans are saying that they don't know many people who've reported job loss or they themselves have lost their job recently. Consumer price index has come down, so that macroeconomic measure of inflation has come down quite a bit. And what is really dragging on consumer confidence, those top line numbers, I think really is people's lingering experiences and pain around inflation. And you can really see that in this slide here. So we're kind of looking under the hood of our Consumer Confidence Index and looking at some of the questions that make up our kind of inflation proxies. So these are when we ask Americans how comfortable they are making major household purchases or, making the purchases, run-of-the-mill, everyday household purchases that it takes to run a household. And we can see that, these numbers, people feel more confident in their ability to make these purchases than they did 2 years ago, but that number isn't quite as high. It's still kind of plateaued under 50%. So those lingering effects of inflation, despite some of the other positive signs and growth within the Consumer Confidence Index, is still kind of dampening some of what we're seeing there, even as we're seeing things improve little by little over the past 8 months or so. Here again, we're looking at some of that election polling Chris talked about at the top. So we asked Americans, in the past 3 months, what are some things you have done related to the economy? How are you thinking about your purchases? What are some things you've noticed? And we can see that 2 in 5 Americans have delayed making a purchase because they didn't have money, or 1 in 5 were unable to pay a bill on time. So again, I think some of that crunch people are feeling with their pocketbook is certainly being felt by a good chunk of the electorate, by the public overall. But there is some nuance I want to build in here. When we drill down into that seen grocery or gasoline costs go down number, so a positive piece of news coming out of the economy, we see wildly different things based on people's primary news source. And that's to say that people's primary news source does go a long way in shaping how they feel about the economy, what they're noticing, what's happening. Mainstream news viewers are much more likely to say they've seen grocery or gasoline costs go down than conservative news watchers, digital, local, or even social media watchers. So, these feelings, these perceptions about the economy are not hard and fast rules. It's not just the consumer price index is getting better, so of course people are going to feel better. It's more complicated than that. It really comes back to, what do people think is happening? What are their perceptions? And what are they noticing in their pocketbook? So that's kind of the general story around inflation and the economy. I do want to take a step back. There's been a lot going on in the stock market too, and so I want to add some color and context to that as well. We do get questions about whether a stock market tumult, some of the turmoil we've seen in the past few weeks, does end up impacting elections. And to answer that question, I want to show you how many people actually have different types of accounts. So lots of Americans, most have a checking account, savings account, a bare majority have retirement funds, far fewer are actually actively invested in the stock market. And that's to say that what happens in the stock market, the tumult, the turmoil, some of the bad news we've seen coming out of that, doesn't end up really rippling out and impacting the election unless the stock market tumult has ripple and knock-on effects throughout the rest of the economy. Then we might see some differences or changes in how people are feeling about the economy and the stock market's impact on that. But outside of that, just a stock market downturn, not a lot of people are actively invested in it and really paying attention to it. So, these aren't necessarily news items that might have a large impact on the election, but again, kind of dependent on how that goes on to impact the rest of the economy. So with that, we will turn over to Supreme Court reform. This has been a topic in the news in the past month. President Biden released a number of proposed reforms for the Supreme Court. And to just take a step back and kind of understand the electoral impact of that, more when we went into field with USA Today following President Biden's announcement of these proposed Supreme Court reforms, we found that more than 4 in 5 Americans believe the presidential election will have a major impact on the future of the court. This is something that holds true regardless of partisanship. So, the kind of existential nature of the election around the Supreme Court is kind of being felt across different pieces of the electorate, regardless of partisanship. Now, when we get into the actual proposed reforms that Biden put out, we've tested a couple of them and threw a couple others in there as well. And we can see that the proposed reforms Biden put out are widely popular, again, widely popular regardless of partisanship. That includes things like establishing a binding code of conduct for Supreme Court justices, enacting a constitutional amendment to make clear that no person is above the law, so in reaction to the presidential immunity case, and imposing term limits for Supreme Court justices of just a single term. These are all widely popular. Some less support from Republicans, but still the support from Republicans rises to a majority, so widely popular around the country. However, some other reforms that have been proposed in recent years, like court packing, that is increasing the number of Supreme Court justices sitting on the bench, is not as popular. It's popular among Democrats, but not really among the rest of the country, which is why I think we didn't see that reform get thrown into the Biden's proposed reforms around the court. However, a lot of these reforms are being proposed because there have been a lot of scandal plaguing the court, some controversial decisions coming down that have really impacted the trust people have in the court as an institution. And we can see that declining trust kind of filter out into specific justices themselves. So here we're looking at the favorability of justices over time with our partners at USA Today. In 2022, we went into field with USA Today in April, so pre-Dobbs, and then just a couple of weeks ago, we asked some of these same questions about justice favorability as well. And what we can see is that some justices in particular, Justice Thomas, Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Alito, among others, have seen their favorability ratings go underwater. And what that means is that more Americans don't like them than like them. And I think that, again, really speaks to some of the scandals that have been plaguing the court, the controversial decisions that have come down that have plagued some of the favorability numbers for the specific justices themselves, and holds serious implications for how Americans view the court and the trust they instill in the court as well. So interesting space to watch as we go further into the election for sure. Now we'll move on to the next topic, free speech on college campuses. I'm calling in from New York. There's a brisk chill in the air that is maybe premature, but definitely giving back to school vibes. So we decided to throw in some slides, some data from a report we released with our partners at the Knight Foundation on free speech on college campuses and how college students think, feel, and experience these really big issues on campus today. And what we can see is that the number of students who think free speech rights are secure continues to decline. It's declining from 2016 when Knight first asked these questions, and it's certainly far lower today than it once was. So what's important to note here is that college students feel that free speech rights are less secure than they once were, and also, they imbue free speech rights as a core principle. They find it a very important right to them, one they want to enact, one they want to embody, one they want to participate in on college campuses. But they also are grappling with what that means as it relates to hate speech, what that means for the implications of their peers and themselves. And that kind of really comes across in this slide here when we ask students whether speech can be as damaging as physical violence. 70% think that it can. You know, majorities, regardless of different demographic groups, agree with this. You know, Democrats and Black students are a little bit more likely to agree with this than other groups, but the point still stands that students feel free speech rights are insecure, they see free speech rights as very important and want to engage with it on college campuses, but are grappling with how to do so. So just really important and interesting data to keep in mind as college students get back to campus, and I really encourage everyone to check out that great report that we released with the Knight Foundation. Now on to the final topic that I'll be walking you all through, the vice presidential picks, another piece of news that broke in the past month. We now know what the Democratic and Republican tickets look like. Vice President Kamala Harris selected Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota to be her running mate. He will be speaking at the DNC in Chicago tonight. And when we asked Americans in this ABC News poll whether they approved of Harris's selection of Tim Walz as her running mate, we found that a bare majority did. And that support really lies with Democrats and groups that, you know, tend to make up the Democratic base and coalition. When we asked the same of Trump's selection of Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio, we found slightly fewer Americans supported Trump's selection of Vance. However, that support does live with Republicans and the groups that tend to make up the Republican coalition. So some interesting things as like the country gets familiar and acquainted with these two candidates. What's worth noting, though, is that many Americans don't yet actually have opinions on Walz or Vance. They're less well known than the top of the ticket, Harris and Trump, respectively. However, among the people that do have an opinion of them, Walz is viewed more favorably than Vance. I think that speaks to some of the positive news cycles that the Harris-Walz campaign has been enjoying. Chris will get into what that means for the election a little bit later on. But something to note, too, on the top of the ticket for Harris and Trump is that, you know, while they are, of course, more well-known than Walz and Vance, Harris is slightly less well-known than Trump. She's more of a blank slate relatively, just given the peculiarities in the 11th hour ascension to the top of the ticket for her. So this DNC Week in Chicago is really a push to get her more introduced to lots of the country. Even among the people that know her, she's a little bit viewed more favorably than Trump, who is less popular. So really important things to keep in mind, like the initial impressions and reactions Americans are having to all of the change that's happened the past month with the presidential race. And with that, I'll hand it over to Bernard, who will walk us through some of the data we have on that. Over to you, Bernard.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, going to talk a little bit about our national poll, our second wave of the national poll. So for a bit of context on this, so we conducted our first wave of our national poll back in May, sort of before a lot of things happened, such as the assassination of Donald Trump. So before a lot of things, but we went back to those same respondents of the first poll and sort of asked them, more questions to sort of gauge how their opinion has been shifting over the course of the election season, and will continue to do so throughout the election season. And so to sort of kick off talking about what we found in the election poll, I think this slide is very interesting because it shows, that Americans perceive the news coverage around Kamala Harris to be much more positive than that of Biden, Trump, or J.D. Vance. And sort of, we've talked a bit about this already, but we typically say that, public opinion and what information Americans receive in the news kind of go hand in hand. I think the next slide sort of demonstrates this really well, where we asked respondents to say whether they feel these words are associated more with Trump or more with Harris. I think particularly notable on this slide is this word weird. If you remember, Tim Walz, who was then just the Minnesota governor, but is now Kamala Harris's running mate, used the word weird to sort of attack Trump and Vance and that whole Republican ticket. And that really seems to have stuck. It got a lot of airtime in the press. And as a result, a lot of people associate that word a lot more with Trump than with Harris. Also, patriotic and brave are associated more with Trump, perhaps because of the attempted assassination that he survived, whereas moral and intelligent are associated more with Harris. But really sort of demonstrating, I guess, the vibe of this election, where Harris is seen more as moral, Trump more as weird. And we do see this sort of sentiment playing into how well the candidates are performing in the polls today. So on the next slide, I'll dig into the ballot a bit. So as we see here, it's pretty much a tie. It has been for the past couple months. Of course, again, this first May poll was conducted before a lot of the madness that happened in June. So if we did conduct a poll, say in June, we probably would have seen a dip in the Democratic performance there. But when we compare how Americans felt in May with how Americans felt in August, there was maybe a slight shift towards Kamala Harris once she was introduced to the Democratic candidate, but still, roughly a tie. On the next slide, I think this is also pretty interesting. We see that when we look at the full ballot, so not the push ballot, but the full ballot containing options to select RFK Jr., another candidate, or select don't know, Harris actually has a small lead. This is sort of within the margin of error, kind of on the edges of whether we really say this is a lead versus just a polling margin of error. But it is sort of notable. I think also interestingly, when we look at the people who don't select Trump or Harris in that first question on the left, they tend to lean more towards Trump. I think the next slide sort of demonstrates possibly why this might be happening, because when we look at just Americans who are certain to vote, so that is the column all the way on the right, they lean a lot more towards Harris. Whereas if you look at people that aren't planning to vote or have a low likelihood of voting, that is leaning more towards Trump. Sort of demonstrating that a lot of the high enthusiasm voters right now are leaning more towards Harris, whereas lower enthusiasm voters lean more towards Trump, suggesting, that turnout is going to be a huge factor in this election. Whether Trump can convince these low likelihood voters to vote for him, to get out to the polls and actually participate, will be a major factor in the election. On the next slide, we sort of see the movement between May and August, I think, in a really interesting way. So for context, this slide just is among people who responded both to our first survey in May and our second wave in August. Pretty much what we see here is that there is a lot of movement between people going from this possible Biden camp into this likely Harris camp, or vice versa, going from this possible Trump camp to likely Trump camp, suggesting, that these are increases in enthusiasm. Although Harris has seen a higher increase in enthusiasm than Trump, But really, there's very few, real changes in, I guess, partisanship. Like very few people are changing their minds from, say, wanting to vote for Trump in May to Harris in August, or wanting to vote for Biden in May to Trump in August. There are also some people getting off the couch compared to May. So for example, moving from that not voting in May into either possible Trump or possible Harris. But again, Harris seems to drag more of these non-voters from May into her camp compared to Trump, again suggesting that Harris is leading when it comes to momentum, possibly one reason why she's performing so well in the polls. But Trump has also seen an increase in enthusiasm, which is important to keep in mind when looking at these poll numbers. Next slide. So this slide shows our response rates, sort of how much above or below average they were for each of these demographics. So on average, around 73% of people who responded to our first wave also responded to our second wave, but it did vary slightly across different demographics. I think most notably among younger Americans who typically are harder to poll. They had some of the lower response rates compared to our first wave, similar with Hispanic Americans, lower income Americans, less educated Americans. Of course, we do reweight our data once we receive it on the second wave, but it is important to just keep in mind that these are sort of challenges with polling that we've known for a long time, especially among younger Americans, that they tend to be harder to poll. Next slide. We did the same thing for Party ID, and based on people's stated voting plans from May. I think interestingly, there wasn't a huge difference in partisanship when it came to response rates. Democrats and people who lean Democratic had roughly the same response rates as people that are lean Republican. There were a bit of differences when it came to vote intent. So people that were possibly voting for Trump, sort of on the edge of whether or not they'd actually vote, had lower response rates in August compared to other populations, which I think, isn't huge given that we do reweight the data, but again, just sort of demonstrates, the challenges of polling in this day and age. Next slide. So I'll talk a bit about our swing state polling. So to give a bit of context on that is also similar to our national poll, where we went to around 2,000 Americans at the start of June and went back to them in early August to sort of see how their opinion had shifted. Again, the swing state poll is also conducted before most of the madness of June and July. And in this poll, we only focused on these 7 swing states that are going to be pretty much deciding the 2024 election, that being Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia. They are the closest states to date, and they also hold enough votes to swing the election. I think for comparison, if Kamala Harris wins all of the states that Biden won in 2020, plus Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that's enough to bring her to 270. But if she doesn't, that will be a different story. But again, we wanted to focus on these 7 states in the aggregate. Conducting individual polls in each of the 7 states is very costly. So we just looked in the aggregate because it does give a good sense of how these 7 states are looking. So on the next slide, we see that again, like it is at the national level, it's basically a tie. Trump and Harris are pretty much in a dead heat. Interestingly, the full ballot isn't as Harris leaning as it was in the national level. And same with the people who aren't planning to vote Harris or Trump. That is also a bit of a tie. So suggesting that there is a bit of a different dynamic than there is at the national level. But again, both at the national level and at the swing state level, pretty much a tie, maybe a slight edge towards Harris, but pretty much a tie. Next slide. So this slide I think is really interesting, showing the percent of respondents who are certain to vote in the swing states. As we can see, there has been an increase overall in the swing states from June to August, but more pronounced among Democrats. Democrats saw an 11 percentage point increase in percent of certain to vote respondents compared to 5 percentage points among Republicans, suggesting that Harris's entrance into the race has really energized Democrats. More so than Republicans, but Republicans also saw an increase in, desire to vote from June to August as well. So a big theme of this election is momentum, whether Harris and the Democrats can maintain this momentum or whether Trump and the Republicans can build up their own momentum to sort of rival the Democrats' increase in momentum. Next slide. So this is the change in the percent of likely voters in each of these regions for Trump and Harris. As you can see here, Harris again saw an increase in enthusiasm from June to August. Trump also saw an increase in enthusiasm from the same time period. Harris is just more, again, reinforcing that right now, Harris really has the advantage when it comes to momentum. But I think on the next slide, we can sort of compare Harris's advantage on the momentum with Trump's performance on the issues. So I think Chris mentioned this before, but the most important issues Americans feel the nation is facing now are the economy, immigration, and third, political extremism or threats to democracy. And we see that Trump outperforms Harris when it comes to both immigration and the economy. The political extremism or threats to democracy thing is roughly tied, but again, showing that while Harris does have the momentum, Trump does seem to control the more fundamentals, such as the issues, and Chris will dig a bit more into this, but including approval and other factors. But that is sort of the biggest story of this election. This comparison or this contrast between momentum and the fundamentals, where Harris has the momentum, Trump has more of the fundamentals. And with that, I will hand things over to Chris, who will talk a bit more about the 2024 election and our projections.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so looking ahead, lots of things to sort of go through. The first thing, though, that we always believe that you should think about when thinking about elections is the incumbent president or chief executive's approval rating. This is essentially a proxy for how happy people are with the government. And what we see is that Joe Biden, despite having stepped out of the race, still has a relatively low approval rating, 37% in our polling, 38 to 40% in sort of the public average. All of those are not necessarily a good mark, though 40% if Biden were running would suggest that he's maybe 50-50. And what the logic of that is essentially that if you can see an incumbent president with 40% approval, and assuming that the entire population doesn't actually vote, that 40% could indicate that essentially there is a winning population still supporting him. If it drops below 40% or her, then maybe that winning coalition no longer is behind the president. However, successor candidates like Harris don't necessarily have that same guarantee. Indeed, when we look around the world in cases where an incumbent president doesn't run for re-election and instead sort of has someone from the same party running, they only win about 1 time in 8 when the incumbent president is at this sort of approval level. So again, this isn't necessarily saying this is what's going to happen this year in our election, but looking around the world, this is typically what happens, is that successors to relatively unpopular presidents don't win. But this is a little bit of a weird election cycle. As some of the slides showed, we don't necessarily even see Harris that closely connected to Biden in terms of governing or how the government's worked. We'll see how the DNC works this week, and if they've done a good job introducing her to the public in a way that sort of lets her claim credit for the good things for the last couple of years, but not necessarily the blame for the inflation or any of the other things people have been concerned with. But again, speaking of the fundamentals that Bernard was mentioning, the fundamentals of Biden's approval suggest that Trump should have the advantage going into the election. Next slide. The other thing that is an important issue, and Bernard was talking about this just a moment ago as well, are the main issues. And again, looking around the world, whoever is seen as strongest on whatever the majority of the public is concerned with tends to win the election. And in the United States, that is still inflation and the economy, and Trump is seen as stronger on the economy. Not necessarily quite as dominant as he was versus Biden a month and a half ago. A +8 on the economy over Harris versus a +9 over Harris on the economy versus like a +15 or so over Biden. But still, a clear advantage that Trump has on the issue. And even on the political extremism or threats to democracy, which is, close to a top tier issue, Harris's advantage on that one isn't quite as large as Trump's on the economy, and more people saying that neither of them are better on that political extremism one. So again, on the issue landscape, it does sort of suggest that Trump should be favored. No, that's fine. You can go to the next one. And even when we look at how people view the economy, people who think that the economy is good or excellent, which is only about a third of Americans, overwhelmingly are supporting Harris. Americans who think the economy is not so good or poor, which is the majority of Americans, a little over 2/3, a plurality are say that they would support Trump or Vance. Now there is some difference between the not so good and the poor, but there is, clearly connection between views of the economy and views of the political situation. Some of that, as Sarah was talking about, might be actually impacted by how you're getting your news and your information. It's sort of you're viewing the economy as good or bad based on your political affiliation, but some of it does very much seem to be driving those political calculations as well. Next. Looking at the motivation of the vote, we do see, and this is something that Bernard was referencing a few minutes ago, that right now we actually see relatively comparable levels of support for the candidate. 60% both for strongly support Trump or strongly support Harris as the reason to vote for them. That is a bit of a change for the Democrats, whereas when Biden was on the ticket, that number of strong support was a bit lower. The number saying it was mainly because of opposition to Trump was a bit higher. That has sort of come down a little bit. So we actually are seeing very comparable levels of support for their candidates, which I think is a different version of that enthusiasm gap closing that Bernard has mentioned. But I think it is worth just reiterating that despite the attention that we've seen on the Democrats for the last month, despite the DNC happening this week and all the sort of positive news stories coming out of that, that Democrats and Republicans are actually tied at that enthusiasm metric here and in the slides that Bernard was just showing you. So despite sort of the glow that Harris may be enjoying at the moment, truthfully, this election should be viewed as pretty close with equal levels of engagement and enthusiasm on both sides. Next. Oh, this is actually the slide I was referencing before. This is the connection of Harris to Biden's policies in economy and immigration. You can see that the majority of Americans say that she has just a little or very little influence on both of these policy areas. The economic policy may be a little less impact, immigration maybe a little bit more, but again, not huge differences. Interestingly, the people who support Harris are more likely to say she'd have influence versus those who would not. But again, it does suggest that Harris is in a little bit of a weird circumstance where maybe she's not going to fully get labeled as the establishment or the incumbent candidate and will be able to run a little bit as a change candidate. And indeed, we're going to do a little bit of research on that in the next week or two to try to get a handle on, is the former president who is running to drain the swamp or the current incumbent vice president who is sort of running as a populist in her own right, who's actually seen as the candidate of change in this election, because they're both kind of claiming it. And we'll have to see sort of which one the public believes maybe a little bit more. Next. And then the one thing that actually we do see as a piece of common ground across both campaigns is this sort of embrace of populism, sort of anti-elite, anti-establishment, anti-institutional ideas. And we can see essentially equal numbers of Trump or Harris supporters agree with the statement, America needs a strong leader to take the country back. 2/3 of the supporters are both bases. Majorities of both groups agree that traditional parties and politicians don't care. Majorities agree that America is a better country than other countries, so sort of that American exceptionalism. So again, these very sort of populist with a tinge of patriotism or even sort of a nationalism in there. But then there's a big difference on this sort of these last two on the left, where there's the Republicans are much more characterized by this sort of nativist idea, this protectionist, protecting American jobs over immigrants. This is a softer version of asking a question. There's certainly harder ways to ask it, but we do see a similar pattern where Republicans very pro nativist type policies, Democrats a little bit more mixed on those. And then faith and religion are important parts. Again, big differences there between Republicans and Democrats. Not to say Democrats there aren't significant chunks of Democrats who agree. Again, 38% saying yes, but again, point of cleavage between the two parties. But the point of commonality is this populism, this anti-establishment that we are seeing both Trump and Harris really trying to claim a hold of. And I think, again, one of the interesting dynamics of the next 2.5 months will be to see which one does the public believe is actually more truly representing these sort of populist urges. Is it Trump, who, again, promising to drain the swamp, but a multimillionaire former president, versus Harris, sort of an up by her bootstraps story, but also a sitting vice president? It's a bit of a weird mixed bag. This whole election cycle has been a bit of a weird mixed bag, though. So one more thing, right? Next, please. So going into our forecast, looking forward into the election, we always like to reiterate that a poll is not a forecast. A poll is a snapshot of a moment in time right now. It tells us essentially about the past. It does not tell us what is going to happen in the future. If you're trying to do that, instead, you should look across a number of indicators to form a summary judgment. So what are we seeing? First, let's go to what we see in our scenarios. We have our sort of 3 scenarios. We're still not really out of this black swan situation with a switch of candidates here relatively late in the game. Our polls are showing Harris in a strong position, but the fundamentals are showing Trump in favor, so it's a little bit unclear. And I think that the position to be in is that there is a very low degree of certainty in what's going to happen right now and a wide range of potential outcomes. So, a month and a half ago, we were pretty confident saying that the election was going to be a very close election, that may be a squeaker for Biden or a squeaker for Trump, but that was really the narrow set of likely outcomes. Now it's a much wider thing. It could be everything from a red wave where Republicans win up and down the ticket to a blue wave with Democrats winning up and down the ticket. It's hard to see right now exactly which way it's going to pan out because, again, things are kind of moving and dynamic, and there's a lot of cross-cutting pieces of information. So what are the experts saying? Well, they're not saying much yet. We have finally got an updated forecast from sort of a lot of the experts and the modelers. They're all basically saying it's still a toss-up, that it's still too early, too close to call, still saying that a lot of the swing states are not too decided. We are seeing the poll aggregators are moving in Harris's favor. So Harris right now leads at the national level in the average of public polls and in some of the swing states as well. And the experts, again, while saying it's a toss-up, the tonality of their coverage over the last 2 weeks has been sort of much more focused on Harris's multiple paths to victory, giving her a little bit of a, positive glow again and sort of their sort of prognostication. But when we look at things through our sort of lens of this sort of multi-model step, we're seeing a little bit more of a jumbled picture where the polls, yes, are sort of favoring Harris at the national level. She's also doing better in the Midwest, maybe closer to tied in the Southeast and the Southwest. In our polling, we think it's still too close to call. But the base rate model, the main issue models that we rely on, both very much still favor Trump. Harris has actually had a good fundraising period since she assumed the ticket. I've seen reporting that her campaign raised $500 million in the last month, which is somewhat unprecedented. She's also done something of the miraculous and has garnered more attention than Trump over the last month. Indeed, looking at Google search trends, which Trump has basically dominated since he emerged onto the stage in 2015 over whomever his Democratic rival was at the time. In the last month, Harris has actually beaten him 2 or 3 to 1 in terms of Google search traffic or news mentions. Again, pulling sort of the rare feat of actually eclipsing Trump in the popular mind, at least temporarily. But you sort of take all of these things together, and we think that this election remains too close to call. We think it remains essentially a coin flip, which is basically where we were with Biden as well. We think it is 50-50, maybe 55-45 in Trump's favor right now, despite the polls being in Harris's direction at the moment, because, again, the strength of some of these fundamental models in Trump's favor. Now, I think the big question, though, for us and what we're continuing to sort of work on figuring out is this so much of a disjunction, so much of a change that some of these historical models may not be as insightful as we have seen in the past. Maybe the base rate and the main issue model don't tell us as much as we've seen in the past because everything's just so crazy and confused right now. But I think, anyone who's saying that, oh, Harris is going to win, it's clear, getting ahead of themselves, getting over their skis. This is still very much far from over. There's a lot of things suggesting that Trump is likely to see a resurgence in his position, likely to perform pretty well. So Ipsos and we continue to say that this election is going to be a toss-up and is going to likely come down to a handful of states in the Electoral College. All right, I think with that, we will take some questions. So again, as I mentioned earlier, please use the GoToWebinar Q&A feature to log any questions. Sarah, Bernard, and I will answer as many of them as we can. All right, first question. Does healthcare include prescription drug pricing in the most important problem facing America? Question, thank you. Sarah, Bernard, why don't you want to take that?
Sure, yeah, it's an all-encompassing healthcare item, so we don't parse it out by those specific ones. We do have some polling we do with Axios, or Axios Ipsos American Health Index, that does kind of look a little bit more granularly at healthcare pricing, and that is a big issue for Americans when we do think about healthcare more generally and the issues Americans have around that.
Yeah. Next question, do we have corresponding data for the impact of media consumption at the swing state level? Bernard, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, we do. I think a lot of those things are have similar trends as they do nationally, but it is something we do have. And if you're interested, shoot over a question, we can pull something out.
Yeah, and I do believe it's in the crosstabs that we've actually published on our website. So if you want to check it out yourself, you're certainly welcome to. Will the Democratic convention have an impact on Harris's standing? Either one of you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, so we do see a post-convention boost for candidates who are in the limelight during their week at the convention. There's some enthusiasm that gets generated, kind of a week of an infomercial for a campaign that does tend to burn off as we get further into the election cycle. So we can kind of expect to see maybe Harris's numbers look a little bit better in the next week or two, but don't hold on to those too closely because we can expect some change from there on out.
Should we expect the next debate to have the same kind of impact that the Biden-Trump debate had? That's a big question. I think it will depend a little bit on their performance, of course. I don't think that we should expect Harris to sort of have the same kind of challenges that Biden had in his debate, question mark on what we'll expect to see from Trump. But I do think it is a risk for Harris because, again, she's sort of in this little bit of a honeymoon phase, a little bit in this phase where she's able to sort of be everything to everybody and isn't having to be terribly specific with her proposals or her policies or anything else. And indeed, Sarah sort of spoke to that, and that's been actually a bit of an asset for her. And I think, an hour and a half on a debate stage, it's going to be hard for her to not be specific. And she's had some good performances in debates in the past, but she's also had some clunkers. So, I do think there is a bit of a risk in puncturing this sort of enthusiasm balloon that she's enjoying right now. But I do think Trump also has some risks. He is someone who, debates have not actually always favored him. He's had some bad moments in debates as well. So I do think it's something that is likely going to have an impact, but probably not to the extent that we saw in June. Biggest surprise in the data, Sarah, Bernard. I think I'll ask each of you to answer that.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's so much data and some surprises over the past month that have just shaken so many things up. But what I found really interesting and kind of a surprise is just the extent to which, main news source really drove people's just awareness of whether prices had come down. I think that just is such a powerful difference in statistic that has so many implications for the election overall. It just goes to show how powerful information channels are in driving views around the world overall and also around this election.
Yeah, totally. I was interested by that as well. Me personally, I think, I don't know if I was surprised by this because I've already seen this in the data, but just knowing that very few people actually changed their minds, say from like Republican to Democrat or Democrat to Republican over the course of an election season. Really, a lot of what we're seeing when it comes to movement is people deciding whether or not to actually vote. And it sort of differs between how you read things in the news or see how people talk about it on TV. Where they really ham up the idea of, a swing state voter or the undecided voter. But in reality, those people are very, very, very rare. And there are just a lot more people who are really just deciding or not whether they actually want to vote.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of my favorite pieces of information as well. It's why we actually designed our surveys the way they are, is to be able to speak to that question of, is it sort of a swing vote or is it about turnout? At least so far, it seems to be much more about turnout and enthusiasm and getting your base energized. But I do think that's one of the powers of the tools Ipsos has, the knowledge panel, particularly, is our ability to do that kind of longitudinal research where we're going to the same people and actually being able to eliminate any of that sample noise of change. And it's literally these people are changing their minds, and then we can ask them why. And it's actually really fascinating to be able to do that. And again, I think it's a fantastic tool. Let's see. Understand that nationally, Harris has a small edge. Given most swing states, Trump has an edge. Is the national edge for Harris misleading or not important? The national edge for Harris is maybe a secondary importance. I think it is important to know where the country is, right? Because even if the Electoral College is how we elect our president, knowing what a majority of Americans think is a good or useful thing to know, just as an abstract concept. But I do think also that the swing states that we're looking at have this nice property of being about 4 points more conservative than the country as a whole. So if the nation is +4 Harris, then we would expect these swing states to essentially be tied. And indeed, that's kind of what we're seeing right now. So it is, I think, actually still useful to have that national data, even if it doesn't necessarily tell us directly what's going to happen with the states that are going to potentially decide the Electoral College. But what we're seeing right now is essentially Harris is basically tied or maybe a point ahead in the upper Midwest states, including Pennsylvania. And if she wins those plus the Omaha district in Nebraska, that's what she needs to win. So it does. There are, I think, some utilities of sort of both the state and the national levels, but I would encourage people to look at both those. And much as we're trying to do here, don't just look at the horse race number in the polls. Make sure to look at the other information, because a lot of times that tells you a lot of interesting things and valuable things as well, like what the main issues are, like how they view the candidates. Are they weird? Are they patriotic, etc.? These are all really useful and important pieces of information beyond just the horse race, which I think sometimes people focus on a little too much. All right, that's the last question we have. So unless anyone wants to put anything in here quickly, I think I'll pass over to Megan to wrap up the session.
Thank you all so much for joining us and spending the time learning a little bit about what's going on in the crazy United States these days. But we will be sending this out to all of you on the call, and we look forward to having you join us next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.